From a falling baby caught once, and then again a year later by the same man, to twin boys that grew up not knowing each other but married a woman with the same name, we take a look at 15 of the most bizarre coincidences ever. Number 15. The falling baby. In Detroit sometime in the 1930s, a young mother must have been eternally grateful to a man named Joseph Figlock. As Figlock was walking down the street, the mother's baby fell from a high window onto Figlock. The baby's fall was broken, and both the man and baby were unharmed. A stroke of luck on its own, but a year later, the very same baby fell from the very same window onto poor, unsuspecting Joseph Figlock, as he was again passing beneath. And again, they both survived the event. Number 14. 3 suicide attempts. Joseph Aigner was a fairly well-known portrait painter in 19th century Austria, who apparently was quite an unhappy fellow. He attempted suicide several times. His first attempt was at the young age of 18, when he tried to hang himself, but was interrupted by the mysterious appearance of a Capuchin monk. At age 22, he again tried to hang himself, but was again saved from the act by the very same monk. 8 years later, his death was ordained by others who sentenced him to the gallows for his political activities. Once again, his life was saved by the intervention of the same monk. At age 68, Aigner finally succeeded in suicide, a pistol doing the trick. Number 13. Poe coincidence. In the 19th century, the famous horror writer Edgar Allan Poe wrote a book called The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. It was about 4 survivors of a shipwreck who were in a lifeboat for many days before they decided to kill and eat the cabin boy, whose name was Richard Parker. Some years later, in 1884, the Mignonette sank, with only 4 survivors, who were on a lifeboat for many days. Eventually, 3 senior members of the crew killed and ate the cabin boy. The name of this cabin boy was Richard Parker. Number 12. Poker winnings. In 1858, Robert Fallon was shot dead, an act of vengeance by those with whom he was playing poker. Fallon, they claimed, had won the $600 pot through cheating. With Fallon's seat empty and none of the other players willing to take the now unlucky $600, they found a new player to take Fallon's place, and staked him with the dead man's $600. By the time the police had arrived to investigate the killing, the new player had turned the $600 into $2,200 in winnings. The police demanded the original $600 to pass on to Fallon's next of kin, only to discover the new player turned out to be Fallon's son, who had not seen his father in 7 years. Number 11. 3 strangers. In the 1920s, 3 Englishmen were traveling separately by train through Peru. At the time of their introduction, they were the only 3 men in the railroad car. Their introductions were more surprising than they could have imagined. One man's last name was Bingham, and the second man's last name was Powell. The third man announced his last name was Bingham Powell. None were related in any way. Number 10. The Bullet. Henry Ziegland thought he had dodged fate in 1883. He had just broken off a relationship with his girlfriend, who, out of distress, committed suicide. The girl's brother was so enraged that he hunted down Ziegland and shot him. The brother, believing he had killed Ziegland, then turned his gun on himself and took his own life. But Ziegland had not been killed. The bullet, in fact, had only grazed his face, then lodged in a tree. Ziegland surely thought himself a lucky man. Some years later, however, Ziegland decided to cut down the large tree, which still had the bullet in it. The task seemed so formidable that he decided to blow it up with a few sticks of dynamite. The explosion propelled the bullet into Ziegland's head, killing him. Number 9. Swapped hotel findings. In 1953, television reporter Yves Cousinet was in London to cover the coronation of Elizabeth II. In one of the drawers in his room at the Savoy, he found some items that, by their definition, belonged to a man named Harry Hannon. Coincidentally, Harry Hannon, a basketball star with the famed Harlem Globetrotters, was a good friend of Cousinet's. But the story has yet another twist. Just 2 days later, and before he could tell Hannon of his lucky discovery, Cousinet received a letter from Hannon. In the letter, Hannon told Cousinet that while staying at the Hotel Maurice in Paris, he found in a drawer a tie with Cousinet's name on it. Number 8. The Spy Next Door. When Norman Mailer began his novel Barbary Shore, there was no plan to have a Russian spy as a character. As he worked on it, he introduced a Russian spy in the US as a minor character. As the work progressed, the spy became the dominant character in the novel. After the novel was completed, the U.S. Immigration Service arrested a man who lived just one floor above Mailer in the same apartment building. He was Colonel Rudolph Abel, alleged to be the top Russian spy working in the U.S. at the time. Number 7. Two Mr. Brysons. While on a business trip sometime in the late 1950s, Mr. George D. Bryson stopped and registered at the Brown Hotel in Louisville, Kentucky. After signing the register and being given his key to room 307, he stopped by the mail desk to see if any letters had arrived for him. Indeed, there was a letter, the mail girl told him, and handed him an envelope addressed to Mr. George D. Bryson, room 307. This wouldn't be so odd, except the letter was not for him, but for room 307's just previous occupant, another man named George D. Bryson. Number 6. Twin boys, twin lives. The stories of identical twins' nearly identical lives are often astonishing, but perhaps none more so than those of identical twins born in Ohio. The twin boys were separated at birth, being adopted by different families. Unknown to each other, both families named the boys James, and here the coincidences just begin. Both Jameses grew up not even knowing of the other, yet both sought out law enforcement training. Both had abilities in mechanical drawing and carpentry, and each had married a woman named Linda. Number 5. The novel. Morgan Robertson in 1898 wrote Futility. It described the maiden voyage of a transatlantic luxury liner named the Titan. Although it was touted as being unsinkable, it strikes an iceberg and sinks with much loss of life. In 1912, the Titanic, a transatlantic luxury liner widely touted as unsinkable, strikes an iceberg and sinks with great loss of life on her maiden voyage. In the book, the month of the wreck was April, same as in the real event. There were 3,000 passengers in the book, and in reality, 2,207. Number 4. The 21st. When King Louis XVI of France was a child, he was warned by an astrologer to always be on his guard on the 21st day of each month. Louis was so terrified by this that he never did business on this day. Unfortunately, Louis was not always on his guard. On June 21, 1971, following the French Revolution, Louis and his queen were arrested in Varennes, whilst trying to escape France. On September 21, 1971, France abolished the institution of royalty and proclaimed itself a republic. Finally, on January 21st of 1793, King Louis XVI was executed by guillotine. Number 3. The taxi driver. In 1975, while riding a moped in Bermuda, a man was accidentally struck and killed by a taxi. 1 year later, this man's brother was killed in the very same way. In fact, he was riding the very same moped, and to stretch the odds even further, he was struck by the very same taxi driven by the very same driver, and even carrying the very same passenger. Number 2. A writer's plum pudding. In 1805, French writer Émile Deschamps was treated to some plum pudding by the stranger Monsieur de Fortescue. 10 years later, he encountered plum pudding on the menu of a Paris restaurant and wanted to order some. But the waiter told him that the last dish had already been served to another customer, who turned out to be de Fortescue. Many years later, in 1832, Émile Deschamps was at dinner and once again offered plum pudding. He recalled the earlier incident and told his friends that only de Fortescue was missing to make this setting complete. And in the same instant, the now senile de Fortescue entered the room. Number 1. The Writer. While American novelist Anne Parrish was browsing bookstores in Paris in the 1920s, she came upon a book that was one of her childhood favorites, Jack Frost and Other Stories. She picked up the old book and showed it to her husband, telling him of the book she fondly remembered as a child. Her husband took the book, opened it, and on the flyleaf found the inscription, Anne Parrish, 209 North Weber Street, Colorado Springs. It was Anne's very own book. Experienced a bizarre coincidence yourself? Share it with us in the comments down below.